trying to see what happens with the future expansion of sports betting, for instance, in the U.S. and what happens in California and Texas. Now that there's some clarity around Florida, I think that's important. Obviously, what happens with iGaming and online casino, right? Does that catch on in more states or not? It's a very different political calculus than sports betting, right?
This podcast is brought to you by Pragmatic Solutions, the leading iGaming PAM platform with a modular approach, including many benefits like a fast, secure, and scalable API-based platform, integrated with all major third-party products and services. Make sure you head over to Pragmatic Solutions and join our smart thinking.
This podcast is brought to you by Pragmatic Play, a leading game developer providing player favorites to the most successful brands across the industry. With an award-winning multi-product portfolio of slots, live casino, bingo, virtual sports, and more, Pragmatic Play is powering up new possibilities of play through one single API. Visit pragmaticplay.com and discover your favorite every time.
Bingo, bango, bongo, we are back here at the Vested Interest podcast. But did you know where that expression come from? It's a legendary gambling expression.
Which expression are we talking about?
Bingo, bango, bongo.
I do not.
It's the legendary Mike Sexton, the classic poker commentator who it was his favorite expression during the high-stakes poker games back in the day. He used to go bingo, bango, bongo whenever he hit. That's it, my friend. Well, it's great to be back here at the Vested Interest, of course. Great to have you with us here, Lloyd, as well. And we're going to jump straight into it today. Benjie, a topic that you brought up that we wanted to bring up in the episode today, which is the recent betting scandals and how these betting scandals have impacted or how they potentially will impact the industry, especially from a North American perspective. A couple of examples that comes to mind here is John Tay Porter of Toronto Raptors betting on his own player props. Shohei Ohtani of the Dodgers scammed by his interpreter, who took $16 million to gamble with. There was also a case a year ago with the UFC, one of the coaches of the UFC who bet against his own UFC fighter, and this is now kind of making its way into media on a more regular basis. And so, just to kind of pass the ball over to you here, Benjie, can you talk a little bit more in depth of these kind of recent scandals and what are your just general thoughts on how this can impact the industry?
Look, first of all, none of this is anything new. The Chicago Black Sox scandal goes back to 1919 or 1918 or something along those lines, which not that great at math, but it's over 100 years ago. So betting scandals are nothing new. They've been going on the global space. We've seen it in the tennis world. We've seen it in other sports. We've seen it in North America. We had, I believe it was SMU. There was a scandal a number of years back, long prior to legislation. We've seen it with NBA referees. So what we're seeing, the little flurry of activity in the recent months, in the last year or so, is nothing new. But there's a significantly larger magnifying glass right now, as there should be, given in the North American landscape that we have, legalized wagering in the majority of states and the largest Canadian province. So that there's a larger magnifying glass now than there was then is understandable. And look, you look at this John Tay Porter situation. I'm almost surprised that one didn't get more press than it did, when you consider how significant it is. You have an NBA player playing on an NBA team, in effect, betting on his own player props and ensuring that he doesn't meet that threshold of expectation in order to make X dollars. We always kind of think in terms of these bigger sports, NBA, NFL, etc., that the players are not that susceptible the way they would be in the college campuses, because in the college campuses, the players aren't being paid and there's big dollars being bet. But when you look at the NFL and MLB and NBA, you look at a Jonte Porter, and I'm not sure exactly what his salary was, but it was minimum wage. And some of these guys come in on 10-day contracts, minimum wage by NBA standards. So correct me there. Maybe it's 500,000.
Not the US minimum wage.
Yeah, not the US minimum wage. But you also have players in the NBA who will come in on 10-day or renewable 10-day, 20-day contracts, who are kind of in the league for a little bit, then back to the 905 league or to the 305 league or whatever league it is where you're a level below the NBA, where you're working for pedestrian income again, right? So some of these players have a relatively short career and get caught up with the wrong individuals and figure if I do something once, make a few dollars, maybe it'll help me with whatever it is that I'm purchasing at home. And once becomes twice, becomes three times. And, that's kind of what we saw with the referee, Tim Donaghy, going back 15 or 20 years ago, whenever it was, where I don't think he intended to become somebody who got involved in quote unquote match fixing, but one thing leads to another. And, we need to have significant education. We can get into all of the, how do we prevent it? There's been a lot of discussion regarding it, but the Ohtani one, maybe Lloyd can emphasize on that one a bit more. That one is obviously just a super strange story by every standard imaginable. But the one that's recent that really catches my attention is the Jonte Porter one. He's been banned by the NBA for life, rightly so. Just a terrible decision on his part, and it compromises the ethics of the game and the NBA game itself.
Yeah, that's the exact right point to leave on. The integrity of the game, the fairness of the game is absolutely critical to the viability of sports leagues and people watching. And there won't be any sports betting without those sports leagues and without people watching. To Benjie's point, there have been betting scandals and sports betting related public backlash for as long as there has been sports betting. While it may sometimes feel that legalization and regulation increase the frequency of these type of events, historically, what's actually been the case is, as Benjie referred to, it really just puts more of a magnifying glass, and it helps reveal and capture more of the scandals or scandalous activity that is taking place. Regulation and transparency tends to bring things out from the shadows and into the light, and historically, I think, was thought to do so without necessarily increasing the actual underlying frequency or incidence of betting-related scandals. The most perilous of which is the Jonte Porter example, where a player is potentially betting on himself, sabotaging his own play. The Ohtani story is kind of crazy and weird. At the end of the day, I think sports fans can overlook an athlete placing bets on other teams and other games and other sports. Certainly, even if it's a bit of a hairy gray line, but sports fans will not forgive a player purposely tanking their own performance. I think where it gets interesting and complicated, again, Benjie covered all these points well, is that historically it was thought that in the big U.S. sports leagues, you're never going to find an incentive structure to convince even a bench player. I think Jonte Porter was making $1.5 million a year for 4 years. Even a lower paid NBA player, how are you going to find the incentive to get him to risk his career for what usually would be, in the scheme of things, a relatively meager payout? The big difference is that now we have same game parlays with player props. I believe Jonte Porter tried to put an $80,000 to win $1.2 million same game parlay on his own player props in. That type of bet was not even possible only a couple of years ago, and at most sports books and in most of the world still is not possible. So the one thing that is potentially different this time is the availability of types of bets that can skew the incentive structure, potentially even for athletes making millions of dollars. But even that notwithstanding, in my view, the benefits on the legalization and regulation side far outstrip those concerns, because it is through the regulated channels that we have the framework and the data capture and the integrity monitoring services and such to detect these things, and for Adam Silver to dole out what I think was an appropriately harsh response, showcasing that there is absolutely no room for anything even resembling Jonte Porter's behavior in the NBA or any of the other U.S. sports leagues.
Just to reply to that really quickly before you jump back in, Pierre, one complexity and further nuance within what you just said is that the benefits of legislated wagering, the outweighing, because we can expose these types of scandals more now than we were able to many years ago, to me is only partially true, Lloyd, because a number of these potential scandals that maybe we're never even hearing about may still be happening and are still happening within the gray markets where there's still significant handle. And of course, we'll never know what the gray market figures are because they aren't publicly touting those numbers, right? And yes, there may be a scenario where if there's match fixing taking place or something which questions the integrity of a match taking place by another player, in addition to a Jonte Porter, that it's being done via legislated channels as well as gray market channels, or just one or the other. But there's significant handle and sharp betting taking place within the gray markets that still isn't necessarily even welcome within the legislated space, that might drive some of this activity that we would never even see or hear or know about. But that might be a whole extra can of worms, a topic that we leave for another day.
Yeah. Another area of significant match fixing has traditionally also been the esports scene as well. And, coming from that world many years ago, I remember the first operators who tried to launch esports betting quickly realizing the fact that the esports world is not organized well enough to take care of those type of issues. And I think that is still haunting the esports world today. As a part of the reason why esports betting hasn't really taken off is the amount of match fixing that goes on in that sphere. But from a regulatory point of view, if we talk about like what impacts this could have against the industry, Lloyd, you talked about player props being a big part of the issue here in the Jonte Porter case. If we were to guess what kind of repercussions it could have against the industry, are we saying that potentially these type of betting could potentially be restricted? Are we saying that certain sports would be would have more restrictions imposed against them? As an example, when the UFC case happened here a year ago on the match fixing side, there were several regulators that forbid betting on the UFC for an extended period of time until the UFC could prove that they were taking this issue seriously, for example. Like, are these the kind of repercussions that we might see, do you think, Lloyd?
It's hard to say as directly as that and make a reliable prediction. What I worry about more is the broader accumulation of momentum of the, cumulative public backlash. And that's what we see in other jurisdictions. You look at the UK, where now a lot of the UK GC's stances on the industry are quite antithetical to the profitability and gross margin initiatives that companies in the industry are setting. And I don't know if you can point in the UK to one specific time or one specific moment or one specific scandal. There really was an accumulation of public backlash, sometimes front page newspaper stories that were a bit exaggerated, other times ones that were more accurate, a little scandal here, a little scandal there, a fine for a public betting operator because they were taking bets from a country they weren't supposed to. And when you add all those things up, you get enough people who are angry enough or motivated enough to actually make it problematic, to call their representatives, to call their governmental leaders and pressure them to, for example, limit the max bet on an online slot machine, or legislatively require that gaming operators check that customers can afford to deposit and lose money beyond certain thresholds. I think these are kind of things that certainly in the US operators, from a regulatory burden perspective, would prefer to avoid. And that's where I have my eye, not as much on any specific response, even though all the types that you are describing are possible and interesting. I think the bigger concern is looming a little more nebulously in the future, and it's the accumulation of all the backlash that has happened and perhaps is yet to happen.
So I agree with you, Lloyd, there. And, Pierre, these are complex topics, right, without any easy answers. And, we are seeing some conversations that potentially have impact. The NCAA and their discussion regarding player props on NCAA players and wanting to ban it across the US as opposed to just on a state-by-state basis. Lloyd made commentary as it pertains to the ability now. You look at Jonte Porter again, if he was making, as Lloyd alludes to, $1.5 million a year, it's a significant sum of money, obviously. But if he's making a bet where he can try and make $1.2 million, well, in one afternoon of NBA basketball, by finagling things a little bit, Jonte Porter has an opportunity to potentially make almost as much as he's making in 365 days of work. I mean, that's a compelling situation and something that now I'm not saying that same game parlays are going to be banned anytime soon, because these are significant revenue drivers for sportsbooks. And if anything else, sportsbooks are looking for ways to double down on that and augment that technology and find other things that could become the next big thing and driver of revenue for sportsbooks. But, and then where do the leagues fit in within all of this? And, one of the things that I've always been commenting on as a bit of a surprise to me in the first 5 years of legislation is how quickly the leagues adapted to this thing, right? And probably the almighty dollar had a whole lot to do with that, because it's what the public wanted, and there's an ability for the league to get involved in this thing and achieve revenue generation from multiple different sources within the betting ecosystem. And it made a lot of sense economically. And now you have a situation where, we have one Jonte Porter incident and one Otani incident. But if you start seeing more and more and more of these things, at what point do we have to recalibrate? And at what point might a league take half a step back in order to reconsider how they want to take their next step forward? And look, these are all conversations that I assure you are happening.
Yeah. And as a final point to this, I want to give a Netflix recommendation here, because the name Tim Donahue was mentioned here earlier. And if you haven't seen the Untold documentary series with Operation Flagrant Foul of the disgraced NBA referee who engaged in match fixing, then definitely check that documentary out. It's really, really entertaining.
Pierre, I would actually make one more point before you switch gears to another topic, and I kind of almost want to get Lloyd's take on this as an investor who I respect in the space. Is how does all or any of this impact your investment strategy, if at all? Meaning, do we pay more attention to investment in companies that can help contribute to solve some of these problems, be it a startup dedicated to athlete education? And I'm just making things up here, but to what extent does this impact your thought process from an investment standpoint?
Yeah, US integrity.
I think I think for people close to the industry, the fact that things like this would happen was inevitable, and certainly is no surprise that these types of sensitivities and, for example, the potential investment opportunity in reg tech and responsible gaming and telehealth for gaming addiction and all that kind of stuff would start to take off a bit more, and certainly see plenty of that all around. I do think from a venture capital perspective, there still sometimes is a hesitation. Can a vertical specific, gaming industry specific B2B reg tech platform that has a very narrow functionality produce venture scale returns? Certainly, it looks like perhaps a U.S. integrity that has almost a monopoly on the market that they've created is on path for a nice outcome. And you could maybe make the argument there's similar opportunities in KYC AML, maybe affordability checks, hard to say, other aspects of the stack. Once you narrow the functionality small enough, I think you do get some total addressable market concerns. And then I think also it increases the focus on really, really high quality founders and management teams who are going to be able to keep the pulse on the public perception of whatever it is they are building, B2B, B2C, and maintain relationships with regulators and other industry stakeholders. And in the event that something not so great happens, even with the best of intentions, we'll handle that properly and give the proper comments in the press conference and whatnot. And so I think it really just increases the reliance or importance of founders, management teams with the utmost professionalism, operational aptitude, and ability to continue monitoring and navigate.
On to a completely different topic here today. We want to talk about, it's a recurring topic in the podcast in general, but around founder energy. Founders obviously experience an enormous amount of stress, both during work hours and outside of work hours for that matter as well, thinking about the future of the company and answering up to shareholders, up to investors, but also keeping their employees at bay as well. And so the question is kind of like, how do you avoid burning out under those circumstances? Benjie and Lloyd, you obviously have a lot of experience from working with founders directly yourself. So I wanted to kind of dig into your own experience here. Maybe starting with Lloyd, just in your experience, in your portfolios, not perhaps directly within your portfolios, but just from your experience in general, how common would you say it is in the first place that founders do burn out, in your experience, during the course of building their organizations?
I'd say, fortunately within our portfolio, and really across all the companies I've come close to in any capacity in the last, I don't know, number of years, I can really only think of one, honestly, that I would describe as failing due to burnout or something like that. I don't, necessarily think that is the frequency. I think the frequency is probably much higher across the broader founder ecosystem. And in part, it's because, you've heard me say on this podcast many times, at the end of our diligence process, we ask ourselves, is this a founder we would want to own a future stake in, regardless of what they are building? And to get to yes on that question, part of what you're teasing through is, does the founder have some of the qualities that you would look for as an investor that make you think they are as unlikely as possible to burn out? And I think sort of there's two categories, or really two qualities. You could probably subdivide them more that lead to such a determination. One, I think, has to do with personality. There are people you meet that just have more energy and seem to have more time in the day than everyone else. We're going to talk to Joe Asher later, who has as illustrious of a gaming industry career as anyone, and then manages to have an entirely separate, but perhaps even more, important career in the world of politics. And I think we all probably can think of people who just are constantly at top levels of energy, just always focused. They're the kind of people who, when you travel on vacation with and you want to stay in and be lazy and eat breakfast in bed, they're already out and they already went hiking and they already, drew their own map of the island and found all the hot spots. So I think there's certainly a level of energy, a level of stick-to-itiveness that you can look for, in founders that hopefully will prevent or help ward off that type of burnout. There are guys like Doug Leone at Sequoia who say they like to find founders who have a real chip on their shoulder, who feel like they really have something to prove to the world, because it is only from that perspective. Only if you feel the world has wronged you and you must prove the world right by building such a successful company. Only then, in Doug Leone's view, can you truly ward off a founder burnout. And then the other sort of second category or characteristic, I think, is looking for someone who is so deeply passionate and motivated about being the only person in the world that could or would manifest their vision, and that they feel such a responsibility to bring that vision out of their head and into the market, that nothing in the world will stop them from making that happen. Whether it's a business, whether it's not, they just feel so resolutely that there is something that doesn't exist, that should exist, and that they are the only or one of the only people capable of making that thing exist. And there is nothing that will stop them from doing so. And so I think if you try to look for people like that, people who naturally are high energy, motivated, a bit type A perhaps, and then you pair that with that type of person finding a business or a product or an idea that is just so important for them to see manifested that even finances aside, there's nothing that will stop them from building it. That, I think, is a recipe for success along the dimension that you're talking. Mark Cuban always says, don't follow your passion, follow your effort. Do the things that just naturally attract your effort, that you actually get more energy from. You do something for 6 hours and somehow you walk away with it with more energy than you had when you started. It's impossible to burn out in such a scenario because you're actually drawing energy rather than being depleted of energy by what you're doing. So I'll pause there, but those are a few of, I think, our thoughts on how we try to avoid or prevent even investing in companies where there would be a high likelihood of burnout. Because to your point, being an entrepreneur is incredibly stressful, lonely, volatile, all these kind of things that really are more difficult than people outside of the world of entrepreneurship often can appreciate.
A lot of good points there, Yeah, a lot of good points there. I think I agree with all of it. I'd love to find some nuggets to pick out where I didn't agree, but I don't really have any. But there's some things that I could add, and I think they're complementary to what Lloyd is saying. And I think that, look, I go back to my days when I was running Don Best and building every day and trying to grow the thing. And the fact of the matter is I never even really thought about the burnout aspect of it. I was just really enjoying what I was doing. I loved it. It was a lifestyle. And I think that, you want to find entrepreneurs that have that level of passion for what they're doing, where it's not really work for them. It's just what they want to be doing. It's the lifestyle they want. It's what they're at. Look, as investors, we're always looking for, where is the exit? Where's the ROI? But I kind of prefer the founder who's a little less focused on that. A founder who's like, I'm going into this because I can build it, sell it, and get out. That might be a founder, if they don't get there quick enough, might burn out. Whereas if you get a founder who's going into it saying, there's a need for this, I'm the right person to make this happen, and he or she views it as something that they're super passionate about in the lifestyle, and the passion for them isn't in building, getting in, getting out, but the passion is building, growing, always achieving something higher, and then those M&A opportunities will be a byproduct of that, but not something that they're striving for from day one, because it's what they're meant to be doing, and what that entrepreneur, it's the lifestyle that they want. It's what they're passionate about. And none of this is to minimize burnout as a topic, and I do think that even the best entrepreneurs, you got to find that balance. You got to find that balance, whether it's with your family, or whether it's with, staying active and getting a run in every day, or going out with friends. But I think that most entrepreneurs who view these opportunities the way that Lloyd projects it and the way that I'm describing it usually have that kind of level of balance where they can find those ins and outs to maintain that balance within their lifestyle. But regardless, they're just so caught up in what they're doing, and it's so much a fabric of their being for that X period of their life where this is what they're doing, that they don't really think of it as quote unquote work that burns them out. It's just what they're doing every day that energizes them and invigorates them, and gives them a reason to get up every day and be excited to face the day. And, I think where you tend to see a little bit more, and I have seen some burnouts amongst entrepreneurs, be it with companies where I have an involvement or don't. And oftentimes those are companies that are struggling. And I think that when you have a company that struggles, it just becomes a little bit harder to maintain that level of excitement and motivation. And the more that you struggle, the harder it becomes. And I think that becomes a challenge, and it can become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it can become less fun. And I think that's where we might begin to see more signs of it. But that just doubles down on what Lloyd was alluding to at the beginning, is finding those entrepreneurs where, that type of failure either isn't an option, or you just know based on who that person is and how sound they are and how they presented this opportunity to you, that the likelihood of them not succeeding is much lower, and just making those right bets as an investor. And again, not to minimize burnout as a topic and mental health and all those things which are super relevant today more than ever, but finding the right entrepreneurs with the right mindset is critical. And in those instances, I think that these types of scenarios would be very rare where you would see an entrepreneur want to take the foot off the pedal because they're burning out.
In 2006, I forgot how many employees Facebook had at the time. It was not a lot. I don't think they had generated any revenue yet. And they were offered a $1 billion acquisition offer by Yahoo. And very famously, Peter Thiel asked Mark Zuckerberg, if you take this offer today, what will you do tomorrow? And Mark Zuckerberg said, honestly, I'll probably go start another social network. And I kind of like the one I already have. So maybe we should just say no. And and Peter Thiel was convinced. And that's why, Mark Zuckerberg said no to Yahoo's $1 billion acquisition offer, and obviously went on to do it, because for him, building a social network, manifesting his version of a social network into the world was the only thing he wanted to work on. Money was not really an issue. Why would he start from scratch rather than continuing to build one? To him, that was the calculus. That's the type of calculus I think, obviously, everyone would like to have invested in a Mark Zuckerberg. So I don't mean to say that is the standard to which we hold all founders, but certainly that mentality, that even if an acquisition offer came along, you would just want to keep building the same product until your true ideal vision of it was realized. That's an incredibly attractive, I think, type of mentality to invest behind.
I think there's a lot of parallels to draw between the mental pressure and the effort and energy that goes into running a company and what a professional athlete would put in their physical activity, where an athlete will be able to pull a lot longer hours and a lot more effort than the standard Joe, and the bodies will be able to withstand a lot more force, let's say. But equally, it's also important for the athlete to understand where the limits are and to understand the body's recovery and so on. And I think, when I look back, an example that I have is a former manager of mine from a very long time ago who burnt out. That was the owner of the company at that time. And he didn't realize it at the time, because I think when you are approaching a burnout, what you do on it and what the input that you create on a day-to-day basis seems normal to you, but it seems it seems the opposite from the outside. And in his case, it was pulling 16, 17-hour days every single day, 7 days a week, sleeping for a couple of hours and then up again and doing the same thing over and over. In his world, that was normal. That was what he was accustomed to. But one day he woke up and he wasn't able to get out of bed. And that was a couple of months of recovery period for him. And I don't think he ever really recovered, to be honest, on that front. And I think that even with that mentality of going full force, it's really important at the same time, I think, to understand the limits or the signs where you go too far. Because I think even if you are Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or whoever, you can put in 24 hours a day work days because there's going to be enough tasks to do. But at some point, you have to be smart enough to say, you're going to step away from the task and actually recover from this type of task. And I don't know, I feel when I think about this for myself and where the limits are for me, I always make sure that when I go to bed that I can fall asleep easily. And if I go for a too long period of time where my head is spinning and I can't fall asleep in the first, let's say, hour of going to bed, I know that I need to focus on getting myself back into balance, kind of thing. Because I think stress is really important in a day-to-day life. Like stress is keeping you alert and it's keeping the energy up and so on. But only if it matches your current situation. Like if you are going to bed and you want to sleep, you should try not to be stressed, let's say, because you need that recovery period during the night. And I think that like some of those kind of tips and tricks are important to remember in this journey. I don't know, but like Benjie, what did you ever? You mentioned like doing the Don't Best guys. This was never really a consideration for you. But do you have any other like advices like that, or anything that you think about, or anything that you picked up from others?
I don't know if I have advice per se, other than to say I agree with you. Like if you are going to bed at night and you can't sleep because you're too stressed about your business, that is an issue, right? And it's something that has to be resolved, right? But look, it's a fine line. It's a fine line between, myself and Lloyd and other investors, and founders who at the end of the day, we believe are going to do whatever they need to do to be successful. And what does whatever they need to do to be successful mean? It means different things to different people. But at the end of the day, it's whatever one needs to do to be successful. Figure it out, right? And we want entrepreneurs that have that level of drive and determination. But we want entrepreneurs that can do it in a way in which it's going to be a healthy thing for them and not an unhealthy thing for them, right? And if you get that dynamic wrong, you create a dangerous situation, right? You don't want an entrepreneur who's working, 18, 19 hours a day, 6.5 days a week, and only sleeping 4 hours a night. And those aren't 4 hours of good sleep because they're super stressed about whatever component of their business. You want someone that has the ability to work as hard as they need to while creating the balance. And, look, Pierre, you're an entrepreneur and you're building your company. And yet, I still see you make some time to run a marathon and to do this and to do that. And it's part of what makes someone a great entrepreneur, is being able to find that balance, to have other passions and things that they incorporate into their lifestyle. So, where one doesn't have that ability, and where that it gets too extreme, that does become an issue. It's not what any of us are looking for in an entrepreneur, nor what any entrepreneur should be striving for.
Yeah, I want to quote quote Joe Levy on this as well, actually, and he talked as well about the importance of sleep for him to stay focused. He quoted this to the GeoComply event a couple of months ago during the G2E event, and he said, one of the biggest kind of changes that he's done in his professional career is to make sure that always get 8 hours of sleep, and that is often the big challenge, because especially individuals like Joey Levy, incredible entrepreneur, incredibly high energy. He's like a force field. He's like a center of gravity that people gravitate towards because of his strong vision and his belief in himself and so on. And it's just important, I think, for those type of individuals to never forget as well that that there are limits to the input that you put into work specifically. Like if you want to be able to produce that type of output for a full career, if you're building your company over decades, like there has to be some form of checks and balances in place to ensure that you output that amount of work on a consistent basis, right? So that you don't go through ebbs and flows in building a company like that. And I just thought that was a really thoughtful way of thinking from someone like Joe, who's still in his 20s, right? And he, with the energy that comes with being in the late 20s and still being mindful enough to think about that. So I thought that was a good way of thinking as well. All right, guys. Jumping over to the third point of today. We're staying in the world of investment discussions here. And I want to ask you, just on a lighter side, what are the least and most favorite things that you ever seen during a funding round? And Lloyd, just starting on your side, do you want to mention the two things that you picked out today?
I think as I thought about this, and I won't use any specific names. All of my favorite things in funding rounds have to do with hustle and resourcefulness, and all of my least favorite things in funding rounds generally have to do with some form of dishonesty or deception. My least favorite things, although I suppose in some way they're also my most favorite, because when someone shows dishonesty, it's easy to pass on the deal and not use any valuable time to consider diligencing. But other than that, there's nothing I like less than when someone tells me Benjie Cherniak's already investing, and I text him in the middle of the call and Benjie doesn't even know the person's name. Or worse, when someone tells Benjie I'm already investing, and Benjie calls me and says, that person told me, Lloyd, you were already investing. That kind of stuff.
Does that actually happen? That actually happen pretty often.
Some more egregious versions of it than you would imagine. Even at the next IO conference just in March, I was speaking with a founder on my way to the speakers lounge. They told me we just got a commercial deal and an investment from company X in the space. CEO happens to be another fellow speaker who was the first person I bumped into in the speakers lounge. I said, hey, I heard you guys just signed with XYZ. He says, I have never heard of that person or company. I have no idea what you're talking about, and no investments get okayed without me. So there could be a biz dev thing going on I wouldn't know about, but I can assure you as CEO, there has been no such investment conversation. I'm a founder myself. I just happen to be a founder and an entrepreneur in the investment management business. I know how hard it is to raise money. I know how compelling it is to try to just project your progress a week or two forward compared to where you are currently, because you're confident you're going to get there and want to represent to investors maybe that you've already accomplished those things. I appreciate all of the reasons and motivations, and don't necessarily think they come from like a bad or evil place. They usually come from just a desire to want to get the company funded so they can get back to building. But yeah, I can't tell you how many times. The more common version that's maybe a little less offensive but still difficult is, oh yeah, we're about to sign a commercial deal with DraftKings, next week, and that's going to be $10 million in revenue for us. And lo and behold, you talk to the person at DraftKings in charge of that, and it's one of 7 different solutions that they're currently considering, and they're still 2 or 3 months out from making a final decision. My favorite things are always hustle and resourcefulness. One that comes to mind, and I probably should name them because it's a good thing, but I won't, just in case any of this is not something they share. There's a company in our portfolio, and when we met the co-founders, they were trying to court a particular strategic executive, a CEO of a large, I think it was publicly traded company at the time in their sector. And they found out that this CEO is a pretty well-known health nut, to the point that during the summer, he used to teach an exercise class at one of the university alumni clubs in Manhattan, I think at 6 a.m. on Saturday or Sunday for 8 or 10 weeks over the summer. And these two co-founders are not particularly athletic or exercise inclined themselves, but they found a way to get into that exercise class, and they went at 6 a.m. every single whatever day of the week it was for the whole summer. And then finally, at the end of the last class on the way out, stopped and said to the guy, love the class. By the way, we went to the same university as you. We're launching a business that we think, you'd be a perfect fit for. Can we have 10 minutes of your time? And he ended up investing and bringing on some very other notable strategic investors and getting that company to a position they probably wouldn't have been to otherwise. And so that's just one. It's the one that always sticks out because I also, Benjie likes exercising, Pierre likes exercising. You guys go out, you ride your bikes, you run. I'm not that kind of person. So the thought to me of waking up early and going to a 6 a.m. workout class that I don't even want to be at every week during the summer, I can appreciate what that means to a non-athlete and can appreciate the hustle that was really behind that. And obviously in that particular case, it worked out well for them.
Lloyd, the added benefit, not only did they get the investment, they got in shape.
Right. There you go. Win-win on all fronts. Everyone should try this strategy. Find investors that teach exercise classes, and worst case scenario, you lose a few pounds.
I'm with Lloyd, Pierre, I'm with you, Lloyd, when it comes to all my favorite stuff has to do with investors that go the extra mile and hustle. We all love that. And the dishonesty piece, obviously there's extreme examples, there's less extreme examples. I think that my, likes and dislikes really for this topic coincide along the same lines. I think one of my favorite things, there's a couple of them. One that happened to me that I was really appreciative of was a company that approached me that I was looking at for investment. I declined them politely. And somewhere along the line during the process where I was evaluating, I'd facilitated an introduction. And that introduction ended in them developing some business and some revenue. And they actually reached out to me. Maybe it was 6 months or 8 months after I declined investment. They'd maintained some level of relationship with me, but they reached out, 6 or 8 months later, indicating that a particular deal had come to fruition and offering me a piece of that deal as a commission for having facilitated the introduction, even though that was never even really discussed within any context, right? And, it just speaks to the integrity sometimes of those types of individuals. And hopefully they're going to go on to build a super successful business. I think they're on the right track. But when you see that, and those are the types of founders that, yes, they're hustling and doing all the right things, but going beyond the call of duty in that regard was something that I noted and really appreciated. And that stood out with me. And then there was another one where I kind of turned down investment into a particular company. And, they came back to me with a response that was just so well thought out and thanking me for their time and thanking me for insights with particular examples of how certain insights and things I said to them, they think are going to benefit them as they go out and build their business. They just kind of went beyond the call of duty of a typical, hey, thanks for considering us. We appreciated the opportunity of speaking with you, which is just a more common lip service. They went well beyond that and really dug in on some of the specifics tying back to things that I said to them. And, again, it didn't have me second guessing the investment. You can't dance every dance. But these are instances on both occasions where I'm not getting involved in the company and they're doing right by me regardless. And those are things that stick out to me and have me rooting for companies like that going forward. And, in terms of things that I dislike, I know that I've seen Roger Ehrenberg talk about this all the time, where you kind of get an approach that's a lazy approach where someone's reaching out to you and they know, they just know that you're investing in companies, but don't take the time to learn anything about you, but expect that they're going to give you some of their time. And that always just irks me the wrong way. It's one of my least favorite things when I just reached out too blind without any thought process other than that throwing macaroni on a fridge and see which investor will or won't speak to you. You got to personalize a bit more. And, look, there was one instance in terms of dislikes where, going back to my early days of starting out investing in companies, and spent some time with a young founder and, within his background described a professional sports team that he had worked for. And I had a relationship there, and he just had never worked with that professional sports team. And there it was on the deck and in his speech in terms of what he was saying to me. And yes, he was from that city, but, I assume he was from that city, but no, he had not worked with that particular team. And, where do you go from there? Like in my instance, obviously I put an end to the conversation, and that was that. And to be honest, haven't really heard from that founder since, and wouldn't know what they're up to, and quite frankly, wouldn't care.
Yeah, I love Benjie touched a lot on thoughtfulness was a theme, I think, and some of those folks who reached out and went above and beyond. And that's something that I always love as well. pretty much everyone sends a generic, thank you email after a pitch, or, some people even try to send a small gift of some sort. And those things are always certainly appreciated. It's better to err on the side of more generosity and thankfulness than less. But every once in a while, I get a follow-up or even a gift that is not so much about the money, but is so thoughtful because someone picked out some little throwaway comment that I made maybe while I was describing myself to them. And, maybe I remember in particular, there's a founder who saw I often take calls with the Jerry Seinfeld background. And this founder and I had a great call together. We enjoyed talking about Seinfeld and some other things. And the next day, even though I told him right away we were not going to invest in the round for a few reasons, none of which had to do with a lack of belief in him, he was at a store, I think, shopping for his kids, and he saw this limited edition Seinfeld Lego set that he bought and sent to me internationally, which definitely was a bit of a pain and not that cheap. But more than anything, it was such a thoughtful gift that even to this day, I keep nearby. I treasure it. I thought it was such a thoughtful thing for that person to do, and really stuck out to me as a level of listening and engaging that they were doing that was not just lazy, as Benjie put it. They're not just taking a shotgun approach, trying to speak to as many investors as possible. They really showed a layer of depth and thoughtfulness that resonated with me. And I still have not invested in this particular company that this person is running right now because there are just some domicile and jurisdiction challenges for us. But I've introduced him to several investors who have probably put in more than we would have anyway. And whatever his next venture is, especially if I can convince him to make it a Delaware C Corp, I will be the first backer and first money in, no question about it.
I have an example on that front as well, actually. One time I mentioned the favorite book that I like, The Little Prince, and I have my tattoos here, as you can see on my arms. I can't really show them properly, but this particular person, as we closed our investment round, ended up sending me a painting, which happens to be right behind me here, for those who are watching. And that was you, Lloyd, of course, when I mentioned this. And I don't know how many times I've told that story to different people, but I thought that was just an amazing thing as well. So all the credit to you as well, Lloyd, for not only being the receiver of gift, but also being so thoughtful and doing this for others as well.
Lloyd is a man who practices what he preaches. He's not just talking the talk, he's walking the walk, and you have the evidence of it.
That's for sure, my friend. I'm reminded about that every single day I step into the office here. And for our final topic of today, we are really excited to have with us here today Joe Asher, who is the current president of sports betting for IDT. But really and truly, your resume is longer than my arm stretches. So Joe, thank you so much for donating your time here today. How are you doing?
Yeah, great. Glad to be with you. You just kind of made me feel old, but everything's good.
Not at all. Benjie, I want to leave the word over to you here. You and Joe are good friends, of course, since a long time before, and I would love to kind of pass the ball over to you for.
Yeah, I mean, look, Pierre, you kind of touched on it. There's no way in 20 minutes of time with you here, Joe, we can cover your entire career. Maybe just start by telling us within the gaming side of things. I know you do some stuff outside of gaming, but within gaming, maybe just give our viewers and people listening in a bit of an update as to what you're up to now.
Well, for the last 2.5 years or so, Benjie, I've been president of sports betting for IGT, which, as you know, is a B2B hardware, software, trading services business. I'm helping somebody with a project separate from that. And that's mostly it from the gaming perspective. A little bit of investing as well in gaming-related businesses.
Joe, so I also took note of the fact that you're the chairperson of the board for the Woodrow Wilson Center. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that, particularly as well, so moving outside of the gambling industry?
Sure. So the Wilson Center was established by Congress in 1968 as America's official memorial to President Wilson. And it's essentially a nonpartisan, public policy-focused think tank, principally focused on foreign affairs, divided up into numerous institutes that specialize in different regions, whether it's Canada or Mexico, Middle East, China, Russia, Africa, Latin America, and so forth. There's also a vibrant fellowship program where the best and the brightest apply to be Wilson Fellows and are then paid to study, receive a stipend to study their issues. And people like Madeleine Albright, Tony Blinken have been Wilson Fellows. And the board is half set by statute, where the law creating the Wilson Center designates certain people to be on the board, like the Secretary of State, Secretary of Education, Health and Human Services, Librarian of Congress, and so forth. And then the other half of the board are presidential appointees. And about a little over a year ago, the president appointed me to be the chair of the board.
I'm interested to know, Joe, since you kind of have a foot into the political side as well in North America, there's been quite a few hit pieces in the last year or two against the online gambling industry. And I want to know a little bit more what you think about the future of the industry from North American perspective. I took note of recently the DraftKings share price have kind of tanked somewhat, and that is in an expectation that it could be more stringent regulation coming up in the next year or so. Is that something that you think a lot about, and what do you think the regulatory landscape will shift in the next year or two?
Well, look, I mean, that's a very broad conversation that we could have as well. Certainly, the lessons from other parts of the world, I think, are on people's minds here in the U.S. It only takes one or maybe a couple more, sometimes negative stories, and congressmen or senators who really start to focus on the issue at the federal level. Historically in the U.S., gambling has been something that's been regulated by the states, and so when it's at the state level, State A may do something, and that'll create issues in that state, but not necessarily flow over to others. But look, obviously. There is some regulation already at the federal level, around things like Title 31, compliance, money laundering type issues. Certainly, I think the topics around responsible gaming, people getting into trouble over gaming and losing gambling and losing more than they can afford, always creates the possibility of legislation in those areas. And then obviously matters dealing with the integrity of sports, such as the John Tate Porter issues that have come to light recently, I think weigh into the overall calculus. I feel like I've been talking for a while, but this is something you could talk on for quite some time. It's obviously complex. Clearly, regulation in some form or fashion, whether at the state or federal level, is going to increase. How much, I think, remains to be determined.
Thanks, Joe. And sorry if my connection cut off before when you guys went to me for questions, but really appreciate you being here. And the thing that I had been thinking about leading up to this, and even just in the first few minutes as I hear you speak, you have more than the average person has on their plate just at IGT. And you also have more than the average person has on their plate just at the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. You seem to find time to still engage with young up-and-coming entrepreneurs who are at the early stages, and in some cases you invest, and other times, from what people tell me, you take calls and offer wisdom and advice. First of all, how do you find the time to do that? But more specifically, given the magnitude and weight of what you do in most of your life, what is it that gets you excited enough about a founder or a startup opportunity to say you're going to carve out a few dollars in a few minutes to really make that a priority?
Well, I think, as you frequently hear, in its essence, Lloyd, it's about the individuals and how you feel about the individuals who are trying to build the business. Also, try to think about areas where I think I can be helpful in some regard. I also like it to be something that I actually understand. There's a lot of things that people come to you with that are kind of hard to follow and hard to understand, at least for me, and I tend to shy away from those and try to keep it simple. And look, I find it really invigorating to engage with young people who are trying to build something or just getting started in their careers. With so much divisiveness and negativity in the world today, I mean, the one thing, frankly, that gives me great comfort in the future are the young people that I get to interact with from time to time. I really enjoy that, and I'm consistently impressed with the quality of the people that I meet.
Joe, I'm going to jump in here. Obviously within the gaming space, you've done a whole lot in your career, from going back, and we're not going to dive into the history of going back to Brandywine, which was acquired by William Hill, and you heading up William Hill USA, getting acquired by Caesars. And I guess I just did go through the history really quickly, 20 years and 30 seconds. But I think where I'm going with this is, and now you've gone into another avenue altogether within the political sphere with the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, as you allude to. And what are some of the things that you take from your experiences within the gaming side over those years and leading companies and working with different segments within the space? And what have you taken there and learned that you've been able to apply with what you're doing at the government level?
Yeah, and Benji, I would just slightly modify what you said. I mean, the Wilson Center really strives hard to remain nonpartisan and outside of the political fray. Yes, everyone or half the people on the board were appointed by a president, be it President Trump or President Biden. But it's really important that the center remain nonpartisan. Look, I think fundamentally, what you bring from one area to another is judgment and good judgment. I think business practices and business knowledge are helpful in my role at the Wilson Center. Things come up where they could be in some way similar to issues that I dealt with at William Hill or in some other area. But I think fundamentally it's about, trying to exercise good judgment, trying to be helpful. The Wilson Center's got a really good team under the leadership of Mark Green, who's the president. The team there, I mean, just within the last week, Jay Powell, the chairman of the Fed, was at the Wilson Center. And, I think the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal, covered his comments at the Wilson Center. And, they had the Wilson Center logo in them. Secretary Blinken was at the Wilson Center within the last couple of months. And so, but fundamentally, I think it's about just good judgment, exercising good judgment, and trying to think through things, and understand, where you can be helpful, and where perhaps not.
Joe, I know this is a bit of a tough one, not to put you on the spot, but if you had more time and maybe more energy, I don't know, and we're a few years younger, starting things all over again in 2024 in the gaming market, what kind of company would you try to work for? What kind of company maybe would you try to start if you were trying to launch something new in the real money gaming space today?
Yeah, I think it's a great time to be an entrepreneur and in the gaming space. And, I've been saying that going back to when the Supreme Court was hearing the PASPA case. I thought, that was just going to create a lot of opportunity. And we've seen that. I think there's opportunity in some of the adjacent spaces, some of the supplier areas, things regarding responsible gaming, things regarding source of funds for gambling, things that have some sort of a regulatory component to them. I'm a big believer in personalization. And, when I open up the app, first thing I should see should be the Golden Knights game or the hockey playoffs right now, rather than some generic login screen, because my app should know that, okay, Joe's into the hockey playoffs and he's probably going to want to bet on that. So I'm a believer in personalization, and then the things around the regulatory landscape. Obviously, it's quite tough for somebody to get something going to compete on the operator side unless it's in a very specific and distinct way. because of the market concentration that we see across the U.S. from an operator perspective. But I still think there's lots of opportunities there, and I do have a fair bit of energy left, Lloyd. So I got a little bit of gray, but don't wheel me out to pasture just quite yet.
There's still some gas in the tank. I like to hear that. What, Joe, like a number of the people listening to the podcast are people that are interested both in investment, entrepreneurship. I think many of the listeners themselves are entrepreneurs that are at the early stages with their companies or looking to start something. And I guess from your end, like just some words of wisdom, what advice might you give to somebody who is starting out now and in the early stages of their career within our space, whether they're an entrepreneur or not, and just kind of getting going in our industry and wanting to build something, a long-standing career within the space?
Well, look, I think it's important to have mentors and to have people that you can rely on and you can turn to for advice. Certainly that was very important to me in getting Brandywine going. And I think of, Lloyd, Benjie, the people who have companies that you guys wind up investing in or getting involved in, right? Then they get to learn from you and to hear your perspective on things. And it's not all about saying, well, if Joe says this, I should do it, or if Benjie says that, I should do it. But you really ought to consider it and help that formulate your own opinion. So I think surrounding yourself with good people is essential, and you got to like what you're doing, right? You got to like what you're doing. Running a business, starting a business is really hard, and I can't imagine doing it if you didn't actually like what you were doing. Then I think it's pretty much impossible to be successful.
Joe, a final question here from me today. You obviously have experience from both B2B and B2C, and in addition to that, the political experience that you have. What are the trends that are driving the industry as you see it at the moment? What trends should we pay attention to in the next 1 to 3 years?
Well, I think trying to see what happens with the future expansion of sports betting, for instance, in the U.S., and what happens in California and Texas. Now that there's some clarity around Florida, I think that's important. Obviously, what happens with iGaming and online casino, right? Does that catch on in more states or not? It's a very different political calculus than sports betting, right? And sports betting, you've got the sports leagues and the sports teams and the major media companies all lined up behind it. You don't really see that with respect to iGaming. So I think the future expansion of that's going to be important. And then what we touched on earlier, which is what's going to happen from a regulatory perspective. Look, I mean, the genie's out of the bottle, right? Sports betting is going to continue to be legal, but what happens around things like college props and how many states move towards banning college props, and is a blanket ban the answer? Because from my perspective, there's a very big difference between passing yards for the Alabama quarterback or the Michigan quarterback in a big game versus how many 3-pointers is some kid in a mid-level basketball game going to make, right? So what happens around regulation, I think, is the other big aspect of this.
I'm going to take the final word here, Pierre, and the final question. I know, Lloyd, you put Joe on the spot a bit earlier. I'm about to do it again. We're very early. You mentioned personalization and your interest in hockey. We're really early in the playoffs here, Joe. The quest for the Stanley Cup. Who's your pick this year? That's the final shot for you.
Boy, the Golden Knights looked pretty good last night, so I'm going to stick with the home team for now. Benjie, they're a big price for sure. Taking my my hometown rooting interests out of it, I think it's actually a pretty wide open cup. I think it's so much fun watching the hockey playoffs, as you know. I'd like to see one of the Canadian teams really make a run at it, and maybe this will be the year after long last. We'll see how far Edmonton can go. So that's it. I'm sticking with the Golden Knights, but being very sober about it for sure.
But what's your team, Joe?
The Golden Knights. Everybody in Las Vegas.
There we go.
Everybody in Las Vegas loves the Golden Knights,
Fair enough.
and they've gotten some of their key players back just for the playoffs. And Mark Stone, who's been in rehabbing physically for the last couple months. 90 seconds into game one, he scores a goal.
Exciting times ahead. Well, Joe, thank you so much for donating your time here with us today. Really interesting insight. We really appreciate that. And we wish you all the best of luck for the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great to have you, Joe.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks.
Take it easy, guys.